Hello, everyone. I would just like to introduce Professor Hakim Adi, who is Professor of the History of Africa and the African Diaspora at the University of Chichester. And Professor Adi was a co-founder of the Black and Asian Studies Association, which campaigned for more inclusive histories to be represented in museums, archives, libraries, and schools, and of the Young Historians Project, which encourages young people of African and Caribbean heritage to engage with history. He was a member of the Mayor London's Commission on African and Asian Heritage, has acted as advisor for exhibitions at the Imperial War Museum and the Museum of London, as well as for Historic England's Another England project. One of the few historians specialising in histories of Africans and people of African descent in Britain, his work has included media appearances, museum and archive collaborations, and 3 history books for children. His next book is entitled African and Caribbean People in Britain, A History, and it's going to be coming out with Penguin in 2022. Hakim.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here, a little bit belatedly, but it's good to be here. And I'm intending really to speak about, or to speak from and about my experience with museums. But first of all, I thought I would just talk in more general terms, or rather pose some questions. And the first question, I suppose, to pose is, what do we mean by decolonization? Today, a lot of museums and others are banding around this term, and it seems to be popular. As a historian, I'm rather suspicious of this term, and I brought up this quote from the former president of France, Charles de Gaulle, who's a well-known figure, and you can see it there. Decolonization is our interest, therefore it is our policy, he said, indicating that decolonization was something which was in the interests of the colonial powers. And if you look at the way the word is often used, that is precisely its meaning. It's connected with the policies of the colonial powers. The British government, for example, talks about, its successful decolonization of Africa or of Asia or wherever it might be, just as the French governments and other governments. So for me as a historian, that requires some questioning. Why is it the term which is being used for what is being presented as positive change by museums and by others? Of course, we might say that the decolonization of the British government or the French government, other governments, was positive in the sense that they were forced to take certain measures, but they took measures which were in their interest. And as is evident today, where they didn't need to take those measures, like the British Virgin Islands or Martinique or Guadeloupe, they didn't take them. So I think as a term, decolonization is a contested term, and we should be rather wary of using it. But then the second issue is what is meant by it? Who is doing this decolonization of museums and other cultural institutions? Is it something being done by the leadership of museums who for so long have resisted any change? Is it being undertaken by those who visit museums? Exactly who is involved? And it's a bit like the decolonization of colonies. Is it being done by those who were the colonizers, or is it being done by those who were the colonial subjects? In whose interests is it being done? So that's really my first question, and maybe something to think about. The second question, which kind of flows out of that, is, should we then be using the term decolonization, or should we be more concerned with issues of reparation or reparations? Reparations is another term which I suppose, creates confusion or over which there is some controversy or perhaps uncertainty. But reparation is really, I think, concerned with and focused on the need for repair. The idea that damage has been caused and there needs to be repair. It's not something necessarily associated with compensation, with financial compensation, or solely with financial compensation. It's concerned with repairing a situation or repairing damage. And of course, the concept of repair, at the heart of it is the notion that the damage should cease, that the damage should not continue. And then there's the question of what repair needs to be undertaken to, if you like, heal the wounds. And when the wounds, it could be argued, have been inflicted for many hundreds of years, then the reparation is a very serious and deep concern, and needs to be thought about exactly what that repair might be. So in the case of museums who have looted articles from other parts of the world, for example, that's just one example, one might argue what kind of reparation might be required. Simply returning things that have been stolen for a few hundred years, is that sufficient repair? Is that any kind of repair? Isn't that just admitting responsibility, admitting guilt, admitting that a crime has been committed? But then there needs to be the repair, the reparation, the making sure that these things do not reoccur. And of course, there's the whole issue of how stolen goods are presented in museums. Without going into detail, very often the term used is acquired. Go to the British Museum and say the museum acquired this item. And what they may mean is it was stolen. So repair necessitates also a change of language and so on. And there are obviously many ramifications of this concept, but I think it's something that's important to consider. The other thing that's important to consider when we look at all of these issues of decolonization and reparations is, why are we discussing them in 2022? Why has it taken so long for change? And of course, in many cases, change hasn't occurred. What is it that's preventing that righting of wrongs, that recognition of crimes being committed, often crimes against humanity being committed? What is stopping us recognizing our shared history? That's another very important question, I think, to consider. It then brings us on to even more interesting questions, which it would be great to get answers to. What is a museum? And I wonder who has the answer to this. Is it a seat of the muses? Is it to educate? Is it to preserve and conserve? What is it? I think even the ICOM isn't clear about what a museum is, or there's a dispute as to how to define a museum. And that's not accidental that there is such a dispute. The second related question is, who is it for? Who should benefit from the existence of museums? Are museums necessary even? And then the third related question is, who decides on these definitions, or who it's for, or what it contains, or how things are presented, or what kind of language is used? And I think that one could argue that very often, a bit like decolonization, museums are institutions that do things to other people. They're not democratic institutions in which everybody discusses what should the museum be, what's it for, who's it for, what should be in it, how should it be presented, and so on. These are things that are decided by those who think they have knowledge and present it to those who it's considered don't have knowledge. And this is obviously a very undemocratic way of doing things, but also a very short-sighted way of doing things. The idea that museums have all knowledge and any knowledge. But of course, there will be different views on these questions, but I think they are very important questions, and they're questions about that relate to the history of museums, who established them, when they were established, with what aim they were established, and so on. And the consequences of that history are still with us, and it's worth thinking about and having some discussion about. Well, I came across this quote. I'm not sure if I can unravel it here, but I think it's a quote relating to the presentation of history and why history is important, and relating to this question of what museums are and what they're for is the question of, if you like, whose history is being presented in museums and for what purpose. And I guess the quote is, one can make one's own analysis and explanation and definition of it, but it suggests the importance of the past. And there are many examples of this, of course, many of them in front of our eyes. But one that comes to mind is the discussion just a few years ago on the First World War, and perhaps on war in general, particularly on the First World War. I remember the powers that be, the leading politicians, the Boris Johnsons and Michael Goves, pontificating about the First World War. And there was some controversy about what the First World War was all about. So it was said, well, it was a, it was a war to save Western civilization. It was all the fault of the Kaiser. It was to save gallant, heroic Belgium. All of these things, which were, I would say, for historians, are complete nonsense. The First World War wasn't about any of those things. In fact, the idea that Belgium somehow represented Western civilization when it had just been responsible, or its governing institutions, its king and others had been responsible for the murder of 10 million or more Africans, is kind of speaks volumes as to how the world is viewed by some of our leading politicians. But this presentation of the past in a distorted way is significant, and it's why we see history being fought over today. Who is Colston? Some mass murderer and human trafficker and so on. But he's fought over and still fought over, or his statue is fought over, between those who say, well, this is a thoroughly disreputable criminal who shouldn't have a monument, and those who say, no, we shouldn't touch this monument, we shouldn't touch this history, it's very important, and so on. So how history is presented, how the past is presented, who controls the past, or who has the ability to present the past, has quite a lot of control over how people see the future, if you like, and also how people see the present. So history is about our understanding of the world, how we understand the world and what's going on in it. And as is clear from the major conflict going on at the moment, how we actually view the world is very much shaped by how it's presented to us. So if we turn on the television, we see what historians of the future might call propaganda about what is going on in Ukraine. And I say it's propaganda in the sense that it's designed to present a particular view. There is a view presented. Other alternative views generally are not presented by the BBC, the mass media, and so on. So the presentation of history is very often along the same lines, and museums play a role in that presentation of the past. And their role has to be questioned. Whose presentation of the past, in whose interest are they presenting the past, and so on. And then in order to give a kind of African perspective on things, this quote kind of really sums up what I've just said much more eloquently. So that's my kind of introductory questions or introductory comments, or you can say reflections on museums, the nature of museums, and so on. Now to say something about my experience as a historian, and I'm intending to start with BASA, as it's known, which was first established in 1991. You'll see from the newsletter on the left that it wasn't originally called BASA. It had such a long name that nobody could remember it, and even the acronym was extremely long, so we changed it to BASA. Anyway, the aim of BASA was it was concerned with the culture and history of those of African, Caribbean, and Asian heritage in Britain. The fact that this history was either not presented or was misrepresented. And although we were particularly concerned with African, Caribbean, and Asian people in Britain, of course, at the same time, we were also concerned with wider issues of history, the history of Africa, the Caribbean, and Asia, and so on, but particularly how it was presented in Britain. And those of us who were involved in establishing it were researching, writing about this history. And the key thing which concerned us was that although we were researching, we were finding lots of information, that information wasn't generally available. It wasn't taught in schools. It wasn't taught in universities. It didn't appear in museums. It was difficult to find in archives and so on and so forth. And so we wanted to get others together who had similar concerns and start to question the powers that be, government, the major institutions, museums, others. What were they doing? Why was the history of Africans in Britain, for example, not being represented? Why was it a secret? Why was it being hidden? And we took a number of initiatives throughout the lifetime of BASA, which was, as you can see, we were still going in 2011, in fact, beyond that. So we were in existence for, 25, nearly 30 years, perhaps, all told. Anyway, I say all that by way of introduction to my next slide, because one of the things that we did in the early days of BASA, I can't remember exactly when, because we used to visit so many different people and institutions, but one I remember very clearly we went to was the Imperial War Museum in London. I can't remember who the director was, what his name was, as it's such a long time ago, and it doesn't really matter who he was as an individual, because it was my concern here is to present the policy rather than the individual. So we went along to the Imperial War Museum. We arranged a meeting with the director, and our main aim was to say, well, our main aim was to ask what kind of history was the Imperial War Museum presenting. It's called the Imperial War Museum. So you might think it's going to include something to do with the empire. It might include the fact that the people from Africa, the Caribbean, Asia participated particularly in the two world wars of the 20th century, both those who were in the colonies as well as those who were in Britain, made major contributions, gave their lives, etc., 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 were in the forces, were air raid patrol wardens, were firefighters, were nurses, and so on and so forth. So this is the history, but it didn't appear in the Imperial War Museum. You could not see any evidence that people of African, Caribbean, South Asian origin participated in this history of wars, or these wars. So we went and pointed that out to the director. I can't remember exactly what the director said to us, but he clearly thought that that wasn't very important, that the museum was fine as it was, that what we were asking for was somehow subversive of its aims, that it was kind of outrageous to ask that, you know, these black, brown people should also be included in the exhibits of the museum. And he, after a relatively short time, he showed us the door to his office and ushered us out. So that was probably one of my first experiences, not of going to a museum, but of actually trying to discuss these issues with a museum or a director of a museum. And that was the response that we received. Well, some years later, the same Imperial War Museum contacted me, actually quite a long time later, because I think this occurred in 2008, so that's at least 10 years, probably more like 15 years after my meeting with our meeting with the director. Imperial War Museum contacted me. We're thinking of having an exhibition called From War to Windrush, so on. Would you come and be an advisor, and, you know, very important, and etc., etc. And so I went and I advised regarding this exhibition and so on. And it demonstrated to me how in the space of 15 odd years or so, a major museum can actually understand, or be made to understand, or come to the realization that it's excluding significant numbers of people, in fact the majority of people in the world, from its exhibits. And not only the majority of people in the world, a significant number of people in the local area are being excluded, or the history of their history, the history of their ancestors, the history of their countries of origin, etc., is being excluded. And when museums do that, they never recognize the deficiencies of the past, what has been hidden in the past. They're full of kind of self-righteousness. Look at us, we're putting on this exhibition, aren't we wonderful? Were they wonderful? Well, not really, because as you will notice, this exhibition is solely about what are referred to as West Indian men and women. And why should they only include West Indian men and women? Why was that decision made? I can't quite remember why that decision was made. But it was certainly mentioned by me, and probably by others, that this was a very limited view. Fine, it's fine to address those from the Caribbean and their contribution. But what about the contribution of others? Those from the African continent, those from Asia, as well as those who were living in Britain at the time. The other problem with an exhibition of this kind, and this is not to negate the fact that this is a significant step forward, but it has to be said that it perpetuates other myths, and one of those myths revolves around what is known today as the Windrush narrative. And that's, of course, very harmful because people from Africa, the Caribbean, Asia, and so on were in Britain, active in Britain, centuries before 1948. The other problem with that kind of approach, that narrow approach, is that significant figures are excluded. And so from that presentation of of Caribbean men and women, those from the African continent are excluded. And you could say it's rather strange that they should be excluded because there are people like Nurse Ademola, who we see pictured here. I guess to give her full title, Omoba Adirenle Ademola, Princess Ademola, we could say, who was the daughter of a king of Abeokuta in Nigeria, who was in Britain throughout the wartime period, was a nurse, studied in London. She was for a time at Great Ormond Street and other hospitals, lived in London for some time, as did many other African nurses during that period. So she also contributed to the war effort. Why shouldn't we know something about her? What is more, she was so important, or thought to be so important, that the British government, the Ministry of Information, actually made a film about her called Nurse Ademola in the midst of the war as part of its efforts to mobilize the empire behind the war effort and so on. It's very unfortunate that that history has been hidden because the film has been lost. Nobody knows where it is, but surprisingly, the Imperial War Museum actually has all these photos. These photos that I'm showing now are part of the Imperial War Museum's collection. But as far as I know, they've never been exhibited publicly. And of course, they didn't merit inclusion in the Windrush exhibition. So this history is lost in a way. It's kind of been it's re-emerged as a result of the research and investigations of the Young Historians Project. And some of the members of the Young Historians Project have presented this history and written about Nurse Ademola and so on. But this is just an example of the way that museums operate or appear to operate, and the limitations of their approach, because you know, I and others were called in as an advisor in 2008. What's that? Nearly 15 years ago. But I've never been asked to advise the Imperial War Museum on anything else. So therefore, one has the impression that you're called in as an advisor just to tick a box, just to kind of, okay, it may look good for the exhibition. Yeah, we've got some historian in, but we're not really interested in what that historian has to say about this history in general. Just as the Imperial War Museum was not really interested when I spoke to the director in 1990, whatever it is. So this is a problem, that museums don't consult with those that they are supposed to serve, those who have knowledge, generally speaking, in my experience. Well, one other experience I had, not exactly with museums, but this is with the Museums Association and Museums Journal. I was asked to write an article about the looted objects in museums, and this is from 2005. A lot seemed to happen around that time, and this is part of the article that I wrote, which is talking mainly about the British Museum, but also other museums. The way they have looted, the fact that they often sent their representatives with the British Army to loot from Africa and also from elsewhere. The way in which museums and governments operate together and have a kind of similar policy towards restitution, the return of stolen items, reparation, and so on. And also it contains something about my meeting with Tony Blair, who was speaking at the British Museum for its, whatever it is, bicentennial in 2003. And so I also asked him why the museum didn't return these stolen items, and he, anyway, I won't tell you what he said. It's not worth repeating now. But the policy I spoke about then, generally speaking, is still in existence. There are some changes with museums. Some museums say, yes, we're thinking about whether we should return these items that we looted. We're thinking about, not quite sure if we can do that. Others talk about being they talk about being trustees. The British Museum is very fond of that colonialist term. Just as British governments used to say they were trustees and they had trusteeships in Africa, they were looking after Africans because Africans couldn't govern themselves. Africans couldn't look after their mineral resources or whatever, agricultural resources. The British government had to look after them. This is the attitude that the British Museum and other museums, all the majors, V&A, British Library, they're all the same. They all have these plundered items. And they claim that they're the world's trustees. I mean, this is simply the language of the 1930s. It's openly racist. It's racist language. It's as simple as that. It's the idea that these white men generally of property, or white men even of stolen goods, are better at looking after the stolen goods than the people who created them. And they even say, well, we might lend them back to you if you're, really well behaved. I mean, this is just outrageous, absolutely outrageous. But this is what goes on in museums up and down the country. And what can one say about it? Museums say, yes, well, we're considering all these things. We're looking into it. We've got a new decolonization policy, etc. It's just outrageous. The only thing that you can say about them is that they're equally racist towards not only Africans but everybody, Greek, Iraqi, whoever, anyone who's not British, probably. They will plunder, loot, and refuse to give back what has been stolen with various pretexts, but all boil down to the same underlying racism, national chauvinism, outdated colonialist logic. So perhaps no more needs to be said about that because I'm conscious of time. Well, another experience I had with museums was with London Museum or Museum in Docklands, which in 2007 began to consider what it might do in connection with the bicentennial celebrations, if that's the right word, or commemorations of the 1807 Parliamentary Abolition Act. And I was asked, along with others, to become an advisor on that work. And of course, the result of that is the London Sugar and Slavery Gallery, which is widely applauded. And of course, it's a step in the right direction because before 2007, there was no reference to the history of human trafficking, enslavement, colonial rule in general, which contributed so much to the development of Africa, development of all the major institutions, Bank of England, financial institutions, even major museums. There was nothing said about it. And so this is a significant step forward. However, again, it's only a step forward. This gallery, permanent gallery, was created, but with the expectation, with the recommendation, with the acknowledgement that it was just a start, and that it should be updated. More work should be done to include the existing population of people of African and Caribbean origin, in particular in London, within the galleries and within this gallery in particular. And none of that work was carried out. Some of us were also asked to advise on the museum in general, because of course this is just one gallery, and the history of people of African, Caribbean, Asian and other origins in London needs to be reflected throughout the museum. And as I say, some of us were invited to participate in some of those discussions. And again, my experience is that they never took place. I think I went to one meeting, and then 15 years later, I've never heard any more. So again, this demonstrates how museums work. They may take a step forward, but the ways in which they work generally are still leave a lot to be desired. They don't seek advice. They definitely don't seek advice from those who have expertise in the area, or they seek advice from one or two people generally. They make an initiative, but they don't build on it. They don't develop it. They don't use it as a kind of principle to inform how they work in museums, in the museum in general. So this is a major limitation. Of course, there's some other historical issues around the gallery, but I don't have time to go into those now. And then the last experience I should mention is with the Mayor's Commission Delivering Shared Heritage. And this was, we worked in this commission for 2 years, from 2003 to 2005. All the major nationals were involved: the British Museum, V&A, Horniman, as well as some local museums and various associations and institutions of museums, libraries, archives, not just in London, but nationally. What can I say? I think the main thing is that I wonder how many museum professionals have read that report, and in particular its recommendations of what should happen. And if not, why not? What was the point of having it, of talking to people connected with museums up and down the country, those of us who were commissioners spending 2 years working on it? These were some of the recommendations, and you'll see, leaving out the first one, establishing a task force, which I don't think was ever taken up, but the others are quite interesting. The diversifying governing bodies, the membership of governing bodies of museums. I wonder how much that's happened in the last, where are we, 17 years. I suspect not much. Diversity of audiences and perspectives, well, again, fostering community heritage partnerships. Diversifying expertise. These are just some. I suspect, my own experience is, I was a commissioner. I think since then I've been asked maybe once or twice to be, my expertise has been sought out maybe once or twice. So these things just haven't happened, but these are the kinds of things which museums and others committed themselves to, recognize were important, but they haven't happened. And I think the question is, why not? Why 15 years later are these things still significant? These recommendations could still be recommendations for most museums and cultural institutions. So that brings me back to one of my initial questions. What is a museum? Who is it for? And who decides what it is, who it's for, what it contains, how that's presented, what should be returned to its rightful owners. All of these questions, who are the decision makers? These are questions for museum professionals on one hand, one could say, but I think they're really questions for all of us. And the reason for that is that museums don't exist in a vacuum, in isolation from the societies in which they exist. And I think all of us should be concerned about these questions, because what is presented in museums and other heritage institutions is presented for a reason. It has an impact, it has an influence, it impacts on individuals, sometimes whole countries and continents, and it influences and affects how we see the world. And perhaps today as never before, how we see the world, how we understand the world in which we live, how we act in that world to make it a better place for everybody. These are very important questions. They're becoming questions of, you could say, as maybe as World War III looms, they're becoming life and death questions. I think history and how it's presented is very important. I think museums and how they present that history, as well as all their other activities and functions, are also very important. So that's some of my experience, and I'm going to stop there.